My ruthless stepmother poisoned my food, leaving me lying on the floor. She tied me up and abandoned me in a dark and desolate forest, laughing as she affirmed, "Now your inheritance is mine." My deceitful father was by her side. But when they returned home, feeling triumphant and sure of their victory, "You should have asked me a few years ago what my life would be like. I would have given you a very different answer from what I am going to share. There is something you should know. My mother Margaret was the most inspiring woman I have ever met. She built a thriving fashion boutique in our small town of Colon, Texas. Starting with nothing more than talent and determination. She taught me everything about resilience and the power of hard work. But after her sudden death 2 years ago, I inherited the boutique and our family home. For a while, I thought I could handle it all. I believed I would live up to her legacy. But life had other plans for me. What I didn't know then was that her death not only marked the loss of a mother but the beginning of a nightmare that I never saw coming. It all started when my father Robert remarried barely 6 months after Mom's death. His new wife Diane seemed charming at first. She was a polished, soft-spoken woman who moved into our house along with her teenage son Yen. Diane's past was a mystery, but she wasted no time making herself comfortable in my mother's house. I wanted to believe her intentions were genuine, that she was here to support my father and help him get through his grief. But little things started to bother me. Diane began to make changes in the house, moving furniture, removing my mother's favorite decoration, and even suggesting we remodel the boutique to modernize it. I was polite but firm. That was my mother's legacy and I wouldn't let anyone erase her from our lives. Diane didn't like my attitude at all and started putting ideas into my father's head. She questioned if I was really capable of managing the business. "Evely is young," she would say. "Maybe she needs some guidance." My father, who had always supported me, suddenly began to doubt me. He began to get involved in decisions that he had never cared about before. And little by little he began to take Diane's side in ways that made me feel like a stranger in my own family. At first I tried to justify it. I thought that maybe it was just part of the adaptation process. After all, blended families are never easy, right? But soon Diane's true intentions became very clear. She wasn't there to help. She was there to take control. The first clear sign came when Diane suggested that Yen work part-time in the boutique. "It will give him a sense of responsibility," she said with a sweet smile. I reluctantly agreed. But Yen showed not the slightest interest in helping. Instead, he spent most of his time snooping around and asking questions about sales and inventory. A 13-year-old had no business knowing that stuff. Then Diane began insisting on attending business meetings with me. She would sit there in silence, taking notes. But her presence was intimidating. Little by little she began to undermine my decisions, questioning my strategies in front of clients and suppliers. "I think we should explore other options," she would say as if she were the owner. I tried to talk to my dad about what was happening, but he ignored me. "Diane is just trying to help. You should feel fortunate to have her," he said. It was at that moment that I realized that he was not the same dad he used to be. Diane had him completely controlled. She treated him like a puppet and let things get out of control quickly. Diane started intercepting my mail, signing contracts without my approval. She even changed the locks on the boutique under the pretext of improving security. I felt like control over everything was slipping out of my hands. One night, while we were having dinner, Diane served me a plate of pasta that smelled weird, but I didn't think much of it. I was too tired to argue. That night I woke up with a terrible headache and a feeling of discomfort in my stomach. I tried to get out of bed, but my arms and legs felt heavy. My vision began to blur. Before I could understand what was happening, I fainted. When I woke up, I was in a cold, damp place. My hands and feet were tied and the metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry and sore. Then the truth hit me like a train. Diane and my father had done this to me. Their voices echoed in the distance, laughing as if they had already won. "We finally did it," Diane said. "The business, the house, everything is ours now." "I never thought it would be so easy," my father added in a cold voice without a hint of warmth. "They left me there, tied up in the middle of a dark forest, believing that I would not survive. But they underestimated me. I was not ready to die yet. With every bit of strength I could muster, I began pulling on the ropes. The bark of the tree they had tied me to scraped my hands, but I didn't care. Minutes felt like hours. But finally the rope loosened enough that I could free myself. My wrists were raw. My legs were shaking. But I was alive. The forest was silent except for the rustling of the leaves under my feet as I stumbled forward, hoping for a miracle. Just when I was about to collapse, I saw a dim light in the distance. It was a small farm, and at that moment it felt like my salvation. But this was just beginning. They thought they could destroy me. They thought wrong. As I stumbled toward the farm, each step felt like a battle. The cold night air burned my skin and my legs threatened to give way at any moment, but that dim, warm, steady light called me. It was my lifeline. A promise that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I felt. I reached the door and knocked with my fist, barely making any noise. For a moment I thought no one would answer, but then the door opened with a creak, revealing an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face. He looked at me intently, his eyebrows furrowed with concern. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked in a gruff but gentle voice. "I need help," I managed to say in a hoarse voice before my legs finally gave out. The next thing I knew, I was lying on an old but clean sofa with a thick quilt covering me. The man's name was Joe Carter, as I later learned. He brought me a glass of water and sat next to me, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Take it easy," he said as I struggled to sit up. "You've been through something, haven't you?" The kindness in his voice was my undoing. Emotions overflowed and I told him everything. I told him about my stepmother, my father, and how they had left me for dead in the forest. He listened attentively, his expression becoming more serious with each word I said. "People like that," he said when I finished. "They think they can take what they want. But you're here and that means they didn't win." His words were a balm to my wounded soul. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt safe. Joe didn't pressure me or force me to do anything that I wasn't ready for. He simply handed me a plate of food, hot bread, and soup, and let me eat in peace. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the small kitchen window, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let Diane and my father get away with it. Not after what they had done. But I also knew I couldn't fight them alone. It was then that I thought of Jake. Jay Miller was more than a childhood friend. He was the only person I trusted completely. We had grown up together, chasing fireflies and sharing secrets. Although we had taken separate paths after high school, Jake and I stayed in touch. He had always dreamed of becoming a police officer, and now he was one of the best on the force. Joe offered me his old landline to call him. My hands trembled as I dialed the number. But when I heard Jake's familiar voice, a sense of calm washed over me. "Evely," he asked with a tone that mixed surprise and concern. "Jay," I said in a trembling voice. "I need your help." I told him everything. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Evely," he finally said in a firm voice. "Are you safe now?" "Yes," I replied, looking at Joe, who gave me an encouraging nod. "Okay. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." Jake arrived at the farm later that afternoon. When he saw me, his face hardened. His usual, always calm demeanor was replaced by a fierce determination. "They did this to you?" he asked, clenching his jaw. I nodded as tears threatened to fall. "They tried to kill me, Jay. They wanted all of my business. The house. Everything. They're not going to get away with it," he said with a voice as firm as steel. Jake wasted no time and got right to work. He asked me for every detail I could remember: the poisoned food, the ropes, the forest. He even inspected the bruises on my wrists, taking pictures as evidence. Joe, ever calm and protective, handed Jay a cup of coffee and offered to help in whatever way he could. "People like that," Joe said, repeating his previous words. "They think they're above the law." Jake nodded. "I'm going to prove they're not." In the following days, Jake began gathering the evidence we needed. He contacted a forensic expert to analyze the remains of the food. It turned out I had been poisoned, a key piece of the puzzle. He also accessed the financial records and discovered that Diane had been siphoning money from the boutique into her own accounts. But the biggest breakthrough came when Jay obtained a recording of Diane and my father talking in the boutique. Some employees who already suspected Diane's behavior had secretly recorded their conversation. In the recording, Diane bragged about her plan to take over everything, laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate my father. "She's practically trapped," Jake said while playing the recording for me. This is the nail in their coffin. Hearing Diane's voice so smug and cruel filled me with anger. But beneath that anger, there was something stronger. I decided I was not going to sit back and watch her destroy everything my mother had worked for. I was going to fight back. That night, as I lay on the sofa in Joe's cottage, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I hoped that Diane and my father had underestimated me. They thought I was weak. But they were about to learn how wrong they were. I'm going for what's mine, I whispered. The determination in my voice even surprised myself. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, and I was ready for the fight of my life. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation and determination. Jake worked tirelessly putting together the evidence we needed to ensure that Diane and my father faced justice. I stayed at Joe's farm during that time, grateful for the peace and security it offered me. But I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows forever. This was my fight, and I intended to carry it out. Jake kept me informed of every development. He managed to obtain financial records that proved that Diane had been falsifying documents to transfer ownership of the boutique to her name. My father's name also appeared on those papers, and his signature was the final seal of their deception. This isn't just fraud. Evilly, Jake said one afternoon while we were sitting in his office going over the evidence. It's premeditated theft, and with the poisoning, we have a solid case for attempted murder. Hearing those words spoken aloud sent a chill down my spine. My own father had given his approval to this. My father, who used to read me bedtime stories and cheer me on in school plays, had chosen Diane's greed over his own daughter. Do you think they will really be punished? I asked with a trembling voice. Jake looked at me with a serious expression. With what we have, they don't have a chance. But you have to be prepared. Evilly. It's going to be difficult. Difficult was an understatement. The day Jake informed Diane and my father that they were under investigation, all hell broke loose. Diane stormed into the boutique with her face twisted in rage. She yelled at the staff, accusing them of treason, and even tried to fire one of the managers who had been helping us gather evidence. Jay was there within minutes, his back flashing as he escorted her outside. "You're done here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Leave now or I'll arrest you on the spot." My father wasn't much better. He called me that night, his voice a mix of desperation and anger. "Evilly, what are you doing?" he demanded. "We're family. Don't betray family like this." The irony of his words was almost laughable. "You left me to die, Dad," I said, my voice firm despite the storm of emotions inside me. "You and Diane don't talk to me about betrayal." There was silence on the other end, and then that was the last time I heard his voice. The investigation continued to move forward. Jake managed to obtain surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that showed my father and Diane loading my unconscious body into their car the night they left me in the forest. The footage was a damning visual confirmation of their crime. As more evidence piled up, I began to feel a sense of vindication. But it wasn't just about me. This was about my mother's legacy. The boutique she poured her heart and soul into. I couldn't let them ruin what she had built. The turning point came when Jake called me late one night. "We have them," he said with a triumphant voice. "The prosecutor is filing charges for fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy. They're going down." Evilly. Hearing those words should have given me relief. But instead, I felt a wave of exhaustion. The fight was not over yet. The trial would be the final battlefield, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. The court date came sooner than expected. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Diane and my father sat at the defense table, their expressions ranging from defiance to guilt. Diane's polished facade had cracked, revealing the cold, calculating person beneath. My father would look into my eyes that Joe sat by my side. His presence was a controlling force. "Remember," he whispered, "you have the truth on your side." The prosecution presented the case with precision, the financial records, the surveillance footage, the recording of Diane bragging about her plans. Everything was there, an unbreakable wall of evidence. When they played the footage of Diane and my father putting me in the car, I saw the jurors exchange looks of surprise and disgust. The defense tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that they had only been acting in self-defense against my erratic behavior. But the evidence was too overwhelming. When the trial ended, it was clear that the jury saw through their lies. I will never forget the moment the verdict was read. guilty on all charges. Diane and my father were sentenced to long-term prison. The judge's words were final. An end to their reign of deceit. As they were being taken away in handcuffs, Diane turned to look at me one last time and whispered, "You'll regret this," but I didn't. Not for a second. After the trial, there was a quiet sense of closure. Diane and my father were gone, and the boutique was finally mine again. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. My mother's legacy was safe and so was I, but the fight had changed me. I was no longer the same person who had been tied up and left for dead in the forest. Now I was stronger, more determined. And I knew that this was just the beginning of rebuilding my life. The day after the trial, I stood in the center of the boutique, taking everything in. For the first time in years, the place felt like it was mine again. The heavy weight of Diane's presence was no longer there. The boutique was no longer a battlefield of manipulation and deceit. Now it was a place of hope, just as my mother had wanted it to be. But the road back was not easy. The damage that Diane and my father did to me was not just financial. It was also emotional. They had eroded trust, both mine and that of the people who worked here. Many of the employees had witnessed Diane's power plays and feared for their jobs. I knew it would take time to rebuild not only the boutique, but also the relationships within it. The first thing I did was gather the team for a meeting in the same office where Diane had tried to take control. I spoke to them honestly. "Thank you for sticking with me," I began in a firm but emotional voice. "I know the last few years haven't been easy, but this boutique is not just a business. It's part of my mother's legacy. And with your help, I want to make it something we can all be proud of again." The response was overwhelming. There were tears, laughter, and most importantly, a sense of unity. I saw hope in their eyes, and that rekindled my determination to move forward. One of the first things I did was return the boutique to its original vision. Diane had made changes, trying to make it something that reflected her superficial ambitions. I reversed those changes and regained the warmth and creativity that had been my mother's signature. The soft tones, the elegant displays, and the personal touches were restored. The boutique became not just a business, but a place where people felt welcomed, inspired, and valued. Outside of work, I began to heal in other ways as well. Jake remained a constant in my life. His unwavering support reminded me that not everyone would betray me. He refused to let me live in the darkness of the past, always pushing me to look forward. One afternoon while we were sitting in a coffee shop near the boutique, he smiled at me and asked, "What's next for Evely Grant?" "World domination." I laughed, even surprising myself. "Maybe just a little. But first I think I need to take a breath and figure out who I am after all this." "Who you are," he said, leaning forward. "You're one of the strongest people I know." I didn't forget those words. They stayed with me for a long time. I had been defined by what Diane and my father had done to me, but now I realized that I had the power to define myself. I was not a victim. I was a survivor. In the months that followed, the boutique flourished. The changes were noticed, and the clients returned excited to see what we had to offer. I even launched a new line of clothing inspired by my mother's first pieces. I called the designs the Margaret Collection. It was a tribute to her legacy and it became a great success. But the biggest transformation happened inside me. I took steps to make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. I consulted with lawyers to secure ownership of the boutique and the house, and I made sure they were a sanctuary once more. I painted the walls, restored the garden, and filled the rooms with memories of my mother. It was no longer a place of conflict, but a home, a safe place, a refuge where I could dream and build a future. One afternoon, while I was in the garden, the scent of the blooming roses filled the air. I thought of my journey, from the moment Diane and my father tried to destroy me, to the forest where they left me for dead, through the courtroom where I regained my life. I had survived, and I came out stronger. Joe Carter, the kind farmer who had saved me, remained a dear friend. I visited him often, and every time I saw him, I would bring him fresh pastries from the bakery near the boutique. He would smile and say, "You're a fighter, Evely. Never forget that." I didn't know it, but now I knew that resilience wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. About taking what life throws at you and turning it into something beautiful. As I write this, sitting in the boutique office, surrounded by my mother's designs and the laughter of my employees. I feel immense peace. Diane and my father may have tried to steal everything from me, but they didn't succeed. They only made me stronger, more determined to protect what's mine. Life is not perfect, but it is mine. And that's enough. Now, looking back, I realize that the betrayal I experienced was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter in which I learned to stand up for myself, to trust the people who really care about me, and to never let anyone dim the light that my mother left me. This is my story, and it is not over yet. But for now I am at peace. And I believe that is the greatest revenge of all.